Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Jason Buffington, here with my friend and colleague, Dave Russell. Hey, Dave.
Hey, hey.
So, on that comment of depending on where you are from, we'd really like to know. We're trying out this new feature gadget mappy thing. So, when you put into the comments, hello from Texas, please count Texas, then we actually have a map. We want to see where folks actually are coming from. So, please pile on. To that LinkedIn thread. Today, we've got a really special topic for you. We're going to talk about the latest Gartner Magic Quadrant on backup software. And Dave, I don't care what title you have or what company you work for, I will always think of you as the founding father and lead author of the Gartner Magic Quadrant for backup for as long as it has ever mattered. And so I'm thrilled to kind of get in your head a little bit on that one today.
Yeah, I think it's going to be good fun. Yeah, good, bad, or indifferent. The 21 years that the Magic Quadrant has existed, I've been involved in it one side or another, including a brief period where it wasn't a Magic Quadrant. It was a retired methodology called a market scope, which is now long gone, and then took it back to a Magic Quadrant. So yeah, I've got the therapy to prove that it's been around for some time.
That's actually probably a good place to start. So a lot of folks see this, monolithic document and that famous 4 boxes and all those little magic dots that everyone covets. Unlike what some people might think, this is not a dartboard where people throw this on. Could you give everyone a chance? Because how does the Magic Quadrant actually come to be?
Yeah, there is, in all seriousness, there is far more work that goes into it than I think most people would realize. And what I mean by far more work, if we just, to your point, take kind of like, what's the process? What's the time frame? And now it's elongated. My first Magic Quadrant, I budgeted 6.5 weeks for, and there wasn't a lot of sleep during those 6.5 weeks, nor after for that matter. But later on, I would budget 6.5 months and then come in under, but half a year-ish, 5 months plus. So 5.5 months, take it to the bank. You're still busy. You're sleeping a little bit, but you're still very busy. A lot goes into it because there are many different data points. It's not just an opinion piece, meaning if it was the two of us, you and I sit down and just kind of talk this through, and a few hours later or maybe a day later, but we've whiteboarded it and we're done. A lot of data points go into it. There's a very long survey with vendors. There's customer references. There's looking back at your notes for literally thousands in aggregate of Gartner inquiry conversations you've had with other data center professionals. And it goes on. There's a lot of financial work that goes into it. One thing that I should mention right off the bat, though, is that it's not sort of like a Consumer Reports or Motor Trends that says the XYZ car, how efficient is that car? Rather, a Magic Quadrant doesn't rate a product. It rates a vendor and their ability in a given market. So vendor meaning, let's call it company X. Are they doing, they may have great,
Maybe.
Right, there you go. That's right. It could be a green company. And so it rates that vendor in the market, and the market has a definition, of course, so that there's some sort of boundary around that, right?
So as you start, before we unpack how that comes to be, because I want to unpack the 6 months, folks have already been piling on like crazy as far as where they're from. Let's take a look at the map really quick and see where do we have people from today. Oh, good. Texas does represent. That's all right. We got
Hi from
Brazil
Colorado.
in the house. Cool. South Africa's in the house. Fantastic. India. We always get good pickups from India, and knows what time it is there. So thank you for joining. From there, but we need to just kind of like the Veeam sales team. We need to get more countries flagged green. So let's hear where everyone else is from. But while those dots are filling in, Dave, you said 6 months, right? So this last report came out in July-ish.
Yeah,
right?
2 weeks ago today.
So at what point does the Gartner team start thinking about the questions? Then there's the vendor window for filling in the answers, and then everything just goes dark for a while, right? So back us up. If it came out in July, when did this thing probably really start in earnest?
Not trying to make it sound like a joke, but not too far from the truth is, January 2nd. Very, very early January is when you want to get your head around, are there new updates to the market definition? Because after you define that, then it really from there rolls out what vendors are going to be included or excluded.
Mhm.
There's a lot of people that would like to be, people, I sort of say that, interspersed with vendor slash person, but, there's a lot of companies or providers that would like to be in a Magic Quadrant. You have to have defensible reasons why someone's in and why someone's out. So you define a market a certain way, and then you come up with inclusion, exclusion criteria. So literally January, we would think about how do you tweak the market if you thought that was appropriate. From there, you would think about any updates you might want to make to inclusion or exclusion criteria. From there, you would start thinking about what are the kinds of questions that you're going to pose to the vendors. And that runs the gamut from customer support to finances to geographical location, your sales methodology, your marketing programs, of course, product things for sure. I mentioned product last because most people will go there first, but just trying to give a sort of a little color for some non-product things that also come into play. So all of that would have to be in place before you ever even go out to the vendors, which would probably historically be end of February, mid to end of February at the latest.
So when you talk about inclusion and exclusion criteria, for those folks that when you download the report, and we have a link for that, right? So we have a link for where you can actually download the report, and we licensed the ability to do that, or I don't know exactly how the marketing folks do it, but we when you click that report, one of the things that was super interesting to me was you see the chart, right? That's what everyone looks at, but when you read through that, it actually talks about those exclusion and inclusion criteria. Like you have to have this many customers in order to be relevant. You had to have this much money or sales in order to be relevant. And if you didn't, then it's not a subjective decision. It's a qualitative decision as to why you are in or out, or why you got added, or why you got dropped. All come from that list. Okay, so we're at the end of February, beginning of March-ish. You've got the ideas of what does modern look like, how that gauge is going to form in the quadrants. Now we go to ask the vendors, right?
Yeah, and so this year, the way that played out is early February, we got the questionnaire, the survey, which is just, I forget how many pages now, but if I said 30 some odd pages, that would not be an exaggeration. And then that's without answers. Those are the questions. So then you have 2 weeks to respond, and then from that point off to your notion of then things appear to go dark if you're from the vendor side. So, most years, the cutoff for what you can include in your responses must be generally available by usually it's end of March. This year, it was by March 1st, which happens to be on the weekend. So for all intents and purposes, it's what did you as a vendor provide to the market, generally available by the very end of February. If I just pause on that, just mentioned moments ago, it published essentially mid-July, but it's looking at product that was in market or programs that were in place, whether the customer support, marketing, what have you, alliances. It's essentially end of February. So there is not quite a half a year gap, but there's a 5+ month gap in there, almost 5.5 month gap. And obviously all vendors, I don't just mean this from just with the company that we work for, every single vendor in there has of course been marching on since that end of February cutoff.
Yeah, so it's good that nobody ever delivers products, in that 4 or 5 month gap, because that way it's always so reflective. So that means in theory that if on March 2nd you delivered the most groundbreaking, most innovative, most market disruptive, solves all the world's problems in a single product for $9.95 a copy on March 2nd, you wouldn't actually see it in a Gartner Magic Quadrant until a whole year later.
If you took it absolutely, by definition, that's true. It would have some factor, but for just to bring it back to Veeam, we had not yet released our Azure product.
Oh, right.
And so but Veeam's actually had 14 either updates or brand new products released since the very end of February, after roughly when we issued version 11. So that would not factor into that. So some of the comments then, which are correct as of that point in time, I mean, one of the important things here is a magic quadrant is essentially a snapshot, a picture of a point in time. And maybe without further ado, why don't we look at the magic quadrant? Everybody goes and just looks at the graphic. Bless the few people that actually read the text. But to Jason's point, there's the 4 quadrants, as you might imagine. Important to just say that it doesn't inherently mean, bad, better, even better, great. Meaning we shouldn't view the different quadrants as necessarily having value judgments associated with them. It's really first and foremost which provider is going to offer you what you need, your company needs, your business unit, etc., is most concerned with. So a niche provider might just focus on a subset of the market and do it very, very well. That's not a value statement on the vendor.
I don't know. I kind of think that, Veeam's dot is the highest on the thing. We should just say definitively it tells us that we're most awesome. But I'm not allowed to say that out loud. All right. So aside from the bullets themselves, and you brought this up earlier, there's a lot of really good intelligence that goes into the summary points along the way of the things that you ought to be looking for and looking against. But I like what you said around not only do the quadrants not say good versus bad, but it's also important, you pointed this out to me when we first started working together, that when a vendor gets a claim of this is great, it doesn't mean they are exclusively great. It just means that was one of the defining points for that company.
Yeah, that's right. And again, we in the comments, Christian's put in the URL from a Veeam perspective. You can go and download a copy of this report, meaning the full report. And to your point, Jason, all the commentary around each vendor is going to have a big paragraph associated with them, and then strengths and cautions. There's typically at least three strengths and at least 3 cautions per vendor, and they're not mutually exclusive. So, for example, one of the strengths listed for one vendor was a strong ecosystem of partners. Well, there actually are a few vendors here that can make that claim. Same with transitioning to subscription-based pricing. It's just the analyst felt that in particular that was a call out for that vendor. So it's essentially those strengths and cautions are trying to be ways to illustrate or help someone with their decision framework, things that they think would be most relevant.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I know we've got a lot of people clicking the map. Let's take another quick look at that. And it's popping up now. Again, if you've just joined us, wherever you're from, love to have you put in the comment, greetings from your locale, and we're going to be updating this map as we go through. We've got a lot more of Europe popping right now.
Yep. A couple more states in the U.S. Here we go. Europe just lit up big time. Well, thank you for everyone in Europe who's joining. So appreciate that. And then a couple folks out in the U.S. also lit up. So very cool. Yeah. Please keep that piling on. More of the earth needs to be green. Pun intended on that one. So let's talk through a couple more of the other comments, and I also want to be sensitive to the clock as well. But so we talked about the one on great ecosystem. There's more than one company that has a broad ecosystem. Now, the opposite of that is probably a little bit more mindful, and that is that when you see, I'm not going to call it a negative per se, but what do we call them? Cautionary notes or So talk about some of the cautionary notes that you saw without naming names, because we want to just kind of make this fair. And then what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, the caution, you have to decide if it's important to you. So again, I like what you said in the spirit of let's not name names. Hey, go read the report. In fact, I encourage everyone to download and at least look over the report for the vendors you're most interested in. One of the cautions for actually one of the vendors that now just moved into Leaders Quadrant, the first caution actually is around release cadence, but code quality. Or product quality, essentially, but code quality and number of bugs and what that might mean from a support perspective. That may or may not be top of mind for you. You may have a very specific environment of which you're willing to make a trade-off for. All right, it may be a little bumpier in terms of the code quality, but they do something that maybe other vendors don't do. On the other hand, you may be a bit more risk averse, and it may be a red flag. Hey, code quality, that's not something we're necessarily comfortable with. Or the opposite could be, around something else. It might be around scalability. In some cases, some of the vendors are highlighted as being very scalable. In some cases, and here I'll just name Veeam, one of our cautions was around that some of the Gartner references said we were a little challenging to deploy at scale. And every vendor, of course, can come back and say, well, but we have an example. So I'll give you mine. But we have an example. I know of one vendor using one instance of Veeam, protecting 20,000 machines with 8 petabytes of data. And their viewpoint was that it was not necessarily difficult to implement. So there's really situations where you've got to decide what's most important to you and how do you handicap your organization's ability to deal with those challenges if they're important to you. So you might say, the Jason company says, look, we know how to deploy infrastructure and we certainly understand backup software. We're not worried about that comment. We're more worried about, something else, meaning we're worried about the comment around it sure seems like higher than average maintenance costs. So we can deploy code, but we can't make money. So that actually colors our decision-making process.
And again, you got to recognize that no two companies on the planet, no two IT infrastructures are identical ever, right?
Yes.
So when you talk about scalability, even things like that, are we talking about 1,000 remote locations? Are we talking about 1,000 servers within a data center and how that architecture is laid? And oh, by the way, where's DNS and where's the production data versus where's the target data? There's a lot more that goes into that particular one. I would probably push back on you a little bit. I don't know many data protection people. Remember, we are kind of in that risk adverse business. I'm not sure I talk to anybody who says, yeah, I'm not sure the code works or not. Because I go back to our own data protection trends report where we had asked an unbiased survey company, go ask 1,500 folks, what matters most to you? By and large, the number one answer was reliability, right?
Yes.
This is what you need in backup. And so if reliability is the most important thing and you had a concern over stability of code, that's like saying, yeah, this is a fantastic car. Most of the time it'll get you where you're going, right? So
I hear you. I mean, I was actually purposely trying to kind of play that soft.
all right, fine.
I don't know how a vendor gets put into leaders quadrant with code issues, but that is the way that this is. One thing I think is interesting, if we skip ahead, there's a slide here, and our producer, Mark, I'm going to skip over one slide and go to the third slide. If you are a Gartner client, I really encourage you to dive in deeper, meaning don't just look at the graphic. If you're not a Gartner client, I encourage you download the report. You can do it from Veeam. Other vendors have this too. So if you don't want to do it from Veeam, you don't have to, but we've got a URL for you. It won't cost you anything, and you get this full report. It is free. And I encourage you to get informed, read everything that's in there, read at least the parts and the vendors that are of interest to you. But if we bring up this graphic, actually back when I was doing the Magic Quadrant, we were our first Magic Quadrant within Gartner to have this interactive capability, which has sort of sliders. And what you see here is you see the criteria. Ability to execute is the y-axis going up and down. Vision is the x-axis going horizontal. You can see how Gartner by default, what they did is they rated certain things high, and that's why the bar, the bubble goes all the way over to the right. Marking execution was incredibly low, so that goes all the way to the left and on down the list. So as a fine tune, you might do the opposite. So Jason, if I put myself in your shoes, you might say, hey, I am the backup admin. I don't care about business model, vertical strategy, geographic strategy, your sales, your marketing, etc. All I care about are product things. And I'm going to maximize those or slide them all the way to the right, minimize everything else. You might be conversely the purchasing department that says, actually, I care an awful lot about those non-product things, and I'm going to do the inverse. So whatever role you have or whatever decision framework you want to apply, you can. And I'll just give you but one example. If we go to the next slide, I just took one of these on execution and zeroed it out. I took overall viability, which means vendor viability. So hang with me for a second. Jason, this is actually counterintuitive maybe, but you can see kind of if you look at the vendor positions on the graphic, the gray dots, if you will, the gray is where, given Gartner's initial weighting, where that vendor was positioned. But now in orange, we collectively have made a change, which was to zero out overall viability. If a vendor goes up, so let's just take here, we can name names because it's not us making a value statement. You can see a Cohesity, a Rubrik, an Actifio, to a slight degree, Commvault goes up. What that means is Gartner felt like the viability of that vendor was actually something of a negative, or they got evaluated a lower weighting. So which would make sense. A newer player, both of which probably going out for Series F funding, Cohesity, Rubrik, Commvault with various, activities going on from a publicly traded company. The opposite can be true as well, meaning Dell Technologies, their viability is extremely high. If you were to drive that to zero, their dot goes down slightly on the ability to execute, because that was something that was favorable to them. And by the way, this doesn't mean because Dell Technologies has a lot of money, that's why. No. It's because the Gartner analyst belief is Dell Technologies is very committed to this space, to this market that the Magic Quadrant is evaluating. So it's not whatever, like Apple, if Apple were to appear here and you follow that line of thought, well, it's one of the largest, market cap providers on the planet, then they could go off the charts. No, it doesn't mean that Apple's committed to the backup space, though.
Sure. So I think two things that we should encourage folks to do. If you have access to Gartner, you should absolutely take care of this. And this is something I admit I haven't played with as much, but two things are interesting. One, it takes the weightings relative to each other that the super smart people at Gartner said and said, hey, look, I want to pretend to be an analyst for an hour. So I'm going to move these sliders to what I think the market really shows. That's one perspective. And then the other, based on what your role is and what your requirements are within your company, you can tweak these around to what fits for you. So I think that's super, super interesting. We've only got like 5 minutes left in the conversation. I see one question that just came in related to, and now my screen froze. So Dave, maybe you can see that. But then I'd like to spend 5 minutes on, let's talk about Veeam's response to where we are as far as the three pros and the three cons.
Sure. Yeah. The question came from Adam, and the question was, Zerto, does Gartner not consider them a data protection company? No, they are, but this isn't a data protection report. This is a backup and recovery. In fact, the exact title, I should know this because I wrote the dang title, but Magic Quadrant for Data Center Backup and Recovery Solutions. Now, Zerto, in the last, let's call it, year and a half, has been vocalizing how they can take their product set, historically known for DRAS, disaster recovery, or disaster recovery as a service, and be able to handle some backup capabilities. But one of the things that probably worth mentioning is, where does this quadrant go from here? This is a strange quadrant, I will tell you, because all of a sudden now you've got 2/3 of those vendors listed in the leaders quadrant. You have everybody going up and to the right, which you generally don't really want to have go lower left to upper right in a diagonal line. That's usually a little indicative that the market's kind of shifting around, maybe stabilizing. But Gartner does call out other technologies of basically a BAS and DRAS nature from vendors, of which Zerto is one. So if we were to kind of think, where might they be going in the future? They might re-swizzle the market definition and therefore the inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria of this quadrant, and Zerto could then be able to participate. Possibly a difference in name could be taking place in the future. But it's not that Gartner doesn't recognize Zerto, and there has been a disaster recovery as a service MQ or Magic Quadrant is but one example. But going back to what you said, Jason, let's just double click just very, very rapidly on what they had to say with regards to Veeam. The three strengths, if you will, were around our Veeam 1 product, monitoring, reporting, and diagnostics, and particularly calling out our intelligent diagnostic capability within Veeam 1 to automatically understand, detect an error, but also suggest a remediated action to solve that error. Mm-hmm. The second was around license portability. So whether you spend $1 with Veeam on-prem virtual and want to move that to on-prem physical, and later want to move that to protect Azure, or AWS workloads, etc. And I could give other examples, O365, but you get the point that a dollar spent here is applicable to anywhere else in the portfolio. And before we wrap up, because we do want to show the map at the very end, if you've just tuned in, please give a shout out in the comments where you're tuning in from, meaning your country. We want to come back and see how much of this map we can light up. I mentioned O365 last there, Jason. That was also one of the strengths that was highlighted. We believe that we have the most deployed O365 protection solution in the market. We've been told that by another analyst firm, but it was the comprehensiveness or breadth of support. I think it's very fair, though, to talk about the cautions. Our first caution was that some clients from Gartner have said that they've had complexity challenges when deploying Veeam at scale. We can offer examples where they haven't, and I'm sure, though, that there are some that have had challenges at scale. That's just the nature of every environment, as you've said. We in general don't think we've got a major challenge there, and we certainly have partners with services that could assist there, but that's but one. A second one was around cloud native application support, and there we are aggressively investing. We'll have 3 releases of Azure this year. We'll have AWS will have at least 2, if not more, releases of our Azure product set this year. So application support, not to make it sound like a joke, but literally as we speak, those bits are being hardened and in QA. So it's not something that we don't recognize, to the point about this is a point in time. And the last statement was really around backup storage. There's one vendor in particular talking a great deal about the immutability or not of where first backup lands. Veeam, we have ways that we can do that. Certainly tape is but one via air gap, but we have via hardening a Linux repository, we can also facilitate a mechanism for no additional cost, no proprietary hardware, or anything like that, to secure that as well. But it was something that they called out. Another vendor they called out as not even the ability to do that, meaning to offer a hardened Linux repository. And that other vendor actually sells appliances too, by the way. So from a Veeam perspective, certainly we respect the cautions that were mentioned. None of them were surprises to us. All of them are in flight R&D wise. But I would just also say, before I hand it over to you, Jason, to take us out, whether you're a Veeam customer or not, go check out the report and check out what's important to you or not. You can see how some things moved year over year. Now, I always caution, every year is a different year, literally. And we all know 2020 is a heck of a different year. But look at what's important to you and then see what the Gartner analysts had to say about it.
And candidly, when you look at the Veeam's pros and cons, let's have that conversation, right? So if there are things that you're like, hey, these are things that are interesting to me, let's talk about them. If these are concerns for you, let's talk about things we might have done since March 1st that might have addressed some of them, that, whatever that happens to be. Hey, so we have 1 minute left. So we want to make sure we give a plug out to Rick Vanover. Rick is going to be doing our Friday noon East Coast show. We're going to be talking about cloud migration with ease. But in order to facilitate that conversation, we got a poll that's going to go live for, I think, Tuesday through Thursday-ish of the week. And basically looking at what are your cloud priorities? Is it around cloud storage? Is it around migration to the cloud? Is it around cloud-based applications? Is around running hybrid? But you get to choose the ending to this story. So please fill in that poll. Let us know what are your cloud priorities for the latter part of this year. And Rick is going to build completely different decks between now and Friday based on what you reply. So please put those in. Other than that, I learn every time I talk to you, Dave, and certainly you've given some insights that most folks don't have on the MQ. So thanks for your time, and of course, thanks for being a Veeamer.
Thank you, everyone, for watching. Really appreciate it. Don't forget to check out the Magic Quadrant report available from Veeam URL. Stay safe, stay positive, and we look forward to seeing you on the next stream.
Take care.